Welcome to Strictly Money at the News Forum, where all voices matter. I'm your host, Saijal Patel. It's November, and it is also the 11th anniversary of Financial Literacy Month in Canada. It's only fitting to mention this, as this show was created to financially empower you so you can navigate your most important financial decisions with confidence. Because the reality is that while financial literacy is an essential life skill and much work has been done in this space, we have a long ways to go. Tens of millions of Canadians still do not have access to it, not in a way that's understandable and relatable. And it's costing them the ability to live stress-free, to build financial security, and to financially thrive. Gail Henderson is the Associate Dean at the Faculty of Law at Queen's University, and she joins me now to discuss her research and work on financial literacy. Gail, thanks for coming on Strictly Money today.
Thanks, Saijal.
Gail, how would you describe the state of financial literacy in Canada, and how well equipped do you think Canadians are?
So, compared to other OECD countries, Canada scores pretty well. The problem is that the overall level of financial literacy across those countries is low, and probably too low for, in terms of having sufficient knowledge and skills to make good financial decisions in an increasingly complicated marketplace. And I think, in terms of how well equipped Canadians are, the other part of the story is that in the last couple of decades, the responsibility for financing things like our retirement and post-secondary education has really shifted from employers and governments to individuals and families. And so the level of financial literacy that I need to make sure that I can cover those big expenses is much higher than I think what my parents needed.
Yeah, absolutely. Things have changed. We're living longer. Before, we could probably bank on a corporation giving us a defined benefit plan. That's changed. We're probably seeing a lot more volatility in the markets as well. So do you think that the type of financial education needs to change, and also the way it's delivered?
Yeah, so I think, thinking about when it should start, there isn't a lot of strong empirical research to show that financial literacy education affects our financial decision-making later on. But if it is going to do so, it really needs to start early, probably at the elementary school level. And so I think in terms of delivering financial literacy education, it probably should start earlier than it currently does.
Let's talk about financial literacy, the definition, because I find that the term is a little bit vague, or even sometimes a little bit misleading, because the thinking is, well, I just need knowledge of certain concepts to be financially successful. But the idea or the concepts itself, we're not sure of. And we know that literacy alone is not enough.
Yeah, so the definition that I've used in my research is the one from the 2010 task force, the Federal Task Force on Financial Literacy, which defines it as having the knowledge, skills, and confidence to make responsible financial decisions. And as you mentioned, financial literacy encompasses both knowledge of financial concepts, but also our ability to actually apply those in making everyday financial decisions, right? And so it's that application piece that makes financial literacy different from other skills, like, that might be related to it, like numeracy or math skills. And so being financially literate is distinct. So it doesn't necessarily follow, if we're good at math, that we will be good at financial literacy. So that's one important thing to keep in mind. The US government uses the term financial capability, and that includes not just having the knowledge, skills, and confidence, but also access to financial products that meet everyone's needs and situation. And finally, I'll just mention that the new national strategy on financial literacy, the Canadian National Strategy that was just published earlier this year, uses the term financial resilience, which includes the ability to persevere in the wake of unexpected financial shocks. So I think that's very much a post-pandemic concept of financial literacy, this focusing on this aspect
Right.
to how to get through an emergency.
Yeah, and I've always said, if you want to be financially well, you actually have to engage with the industry, don't you? We're going to take a quick break, Gail. We'll be right back. Welcome back. I'm here with Gail Henderson, professor at Queen's University. Gail, we always say that finance is personal, right? You can't take a cookie cutter approach to education, especially because the type of education that someone needs who's living paycheck to paycheck is going to be very different to someone who has the ability to invest and build wealth. What's your advice to those who are in a position to actually financially educate their workforce or clients?
Yeah, so our research focused on financial literacy in elementary schools, but I think this applies across the board. In some cases, financial literacy education materials focus exclusively on individual responsibility, which of course is a very important aspect of financial literacy and needs emphasis. But if you focus exclusively on that and don't at least acknowledge the social factors and the systemic shocks like a global pandemic that can affect people's finances, then the lessons in those materials are going to ring hollow for those where it doesn't reflect their lived experiences. And so I think making sure that financial literacy education is relevant to everyone includes acknowledging those external factors that affect our ability to be financially successful and have financial well-being and stability.
Are you noticing that there are certain groups that are more, say, financially vulnerable and also literate compared to others?
Yeah, so there has historically been a gap in the financial literacy of men and women. Women in particular tend to show less confidence in making financial decisions.
Yeah.
There's some evidence that that gap is closing, looking at the test scores, recent test scores of 15-year-olds across 7 Canadian provinces. There wasn't a gender gap, but that doesn't mean that one won't appear as those high schoolers reach adulthood. So I think we have to make sure that women feel confident about making financial decisions that are suited to their needs and situation. And the other group is the one you've mentioned, Canadians who are living paycheck to paycheck. And often that group has better financial literacy when it comes to things like budgeting and knowing what things cost, but they just have a much smaller margin of error for choosing a bad credit product or a bad investment product. And so that's why financial literacy is so essential to that group.
So let's talk about financial literacy in young children, because that's where you've done a lot of work on. How would you rate the formal financial education in schools?
So it's very mixed across the country in terms of whether provinces mandate it, at what grade level, and how it's integrated into the curriculum. The Ontario government has, just as of last year, made it a mandatory part of the math curriculum in elementary schools. And our research found that Ontario elementary school teachers are really enthusiastic about incorporating financial literacy education into the curriculum, but they need support to do it. So in particular, they need better curriculum resources provided by the Ministry of Education, and also some support for professional development to raise teachers' level of confidence around financial literacy in order to teach it effectively.
Yeah, I've always said, teachers are great at conveying concepts that are age appropriate, but they may not necessarily be the subject matter expert. On the other hand, you have, say, people in the financial services industry that are subject matter experts. And some of the concern, though, has been that there might be biases creeping in. So how do you think that relationship could play out?
Yeah, so there is definitely a heavy reliance on the financial services industry to supply curriculum resources. That was mentioned in the 2010 task force report. And there is a concern that those materials are going to potentially evidence some bias in favor of the industry. Our research showed that in terms of key themes, looking at comparing those resources to those produced by governments or nonprofits, the key themes tends to be the same. The difference is the one I mentioned earlier with respect to, industry resources tend to focus exclusively on individual responsibility, and so might not sufficiently speak to the lived experiences of Canadians living on a low and moderate income.
Okay, we have about 15 seconds left, Gail. If there's one message you have about financial literacy, what would it be?
I think we need more research. There's very little empirical research in this area. And so, in order to know what to do effectively, what will be effective, we just need more research.
Okay, Gail Henderson, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you.
Gail Henderson is a professor at Queen's University. Welcome back to Strictly Money. If the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us anything, it's that it's created great disparity in people's financial health. There were many Canadians who lost their job and suffered financial hardship, but there were many others who stayed employed and saw their bank account bulk up. It's not that they didn't want to spend their money, it was that they couldn't because restaurants and entertainment places and shopping malls were shut. In fact, it's predicted that those forced savings amount to $180 billion. Stephanie Holmes-Winton is the founder and CEO of CacheFlo and does a lot of work on helping Canadians understand their spending patterns so they can create better saving habits. And she joins me now. Hi, Stephanie. Great to have you on the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So are you surprised at the amount of money people have saved during the pandemic? And do you think that those habits, let's say they're good habits, formed, will stay?
Unfortunately, I think that it's given us a false sense of security and that all the high-risk activities, the things that we're most likely to overspend on, were the things that were limited during the pandemic. And so when we get released from that, we have a chance that it's going to continue, it's going to come back. But worse than that, there are expenses we started putting money towards during the pandemic that we didn't spend on before.
Okay.
And those might continue too. So we might see one stack on top of the other.
What kind of expenses did you see?
Oh, well, we see more people buying things online, which is easy and fast. We also see people saying, well, since I couldn't have this, I'm going to splurge on improving my home. Since I couldn't go on vacation, I'm going to put a hot tub out or a pool out. Yeah. And those things are going to come with additional maintenance expenses through the years, even when all the other spending comes back. So we are going to have to be very careful not to backslide.
Okay. You have a lot of insights into how people save. Why do you think it's easier for some people to save and not others? And I don't mean the people who live paycheck to paycheck, because let's be honest, it's very hard for them to save. It's not easy to tell them to cut expenses because we know there's a floor to expenses. But for the others.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges to saving when you are paycheck to paycheck is the more obvious one. But when you have a greater income, and in theory, you should be able to save, one of the challenges is how do I control my spending going forward? And too often our strategy to managing spending is the traditional budgeting approach. And when we take that approach, what we end up doing is we think that if I look at where I did spend my money, that will give me clues to what to change. But we don't find people are overly good at that. They need a plan of a limit of how much they're going to spend on things they can control. And they need to change their spending environment to make that easier to happen. And if we're trying to add up every single expense that we knew we spent too much last month to save, adding those things up won't necessarily change going forward. So I think we need to let go of the past and really focus on what can I control next.
It's interesting that you talked about the environment, because part of the challenge that I see is that we are living in a world of instant gratification. And, marketing is so much more sophisticated. And if we're not aware, we get lured into spending. How much, from your sense of that spending, at least our spending habits, are subconscious?
Oh, a lot of it is subconscious. The amount of people who are well educated and more knowledgeable about how you make buying decisions that are designing your shopping experience is scary, right? You're outnumbered. You are outnumbered. If you go to one of those stores that the bulk discount stores, I won't name the store, but it's incredibly clever. The store is designed to look like a warehouse, which makes you think that there's no overhead, no excessive overhead. And when you walk out of that store, there's a million tempting things that you'll never see again. If you bought them, your receipt shows you in big print how much you saved and tiny print how much you spent. So those little things affect us all the time.
So you don't believe budgets work necessarily, or is there a way to sort of revamp it so it does work?
I think the concept of traditional budgeting works really well with things that have a beginning and an end. So if you're redoing a room, if you're planning a trip, a budget is perfect. It doesn't have this ongoing overwhelming sense. When it comes to day-to-day spending, we need a spending limit. We need to physically separate it, put it in a separate account, and we need to have an automation that's topping that account up for us. We shouldn't have everything all commingled. It's too hard. And tracking what you spent isn't nearly as important as it is to not overspend, to limit how much you spend. It really doesn't matter if you bought 20 coffees. If you spent less next month and you save, who cares?
Yeah. All right. We're going to continue this conversation. We're going to take a quick break. Stephanie, before the break, we were talking about budgeting and different ways to make it work, including, or separating sort of the buckets. So do you think pay yourself is a concept that works? And I should probably talk about what it is. It's essentially paying yourself, right? You take a percentage of your paycheck and it goes into a separate account and you don't see it and it goes towards goals. Do you think that's a good way for people to save?
I think we've convinced ourselves it's an easy way to think about changing our financial trajectory. The problem is that paying yourself first doesn't mean you changed your spending habits unless you have no access to credit and no access to overdraft. So if you paid yourself first, but you didn't change your spending habits, that may just mean that those extra expenses went on your credit card this month. That did not get you ahead. So that idea I talked about before the break, where we separate how much we're going to spend on that weekly basis, that day-to-day spending, that is still crucial. Automating savings, not necessarily pay yourself first and hope that makes up, tons of human behavior changes.
Yeah.
Automating savings is brilliant and works very well.
Okay. So you created tools or a software that helps people reduce their fear around managing their finances. I'm interested in knowing what sort of gap that you saw and that opportunity to fill that gap.
Yeah, so we built education tools first for financial professionals because sadly, if we look into the financial services industry, it's no wonder we have a challenge with managing day-to-day spending. There is no education for financial professionals or tools for that matter to enable them to teach their clients anything other than traditional budgeting. And there isn't actually real tools for advisors to help with that. They just say stuff. So what we found is how could we expect differently? So we created the Certified CacheFlo Specialist program that financial professionals can take. And we built software along with it that supports that idea I was talking about earlier of physically separating our day-to-day spending. And in that case, the software actually prescribes a specific number for an individual. And then the advisor can help them put that money to work to pay themselves first next after they control spending. On the client end, we've built e-learning and an app because financial literacy efforts aren't really working well. And a lot of that has to do with if you learn information about money and then you don't know how to apply it to yourself, it's really difficult. So we've made tools where you can take something you learn in 4 or 5 minutes, and then you can apply it to your own scenario using the tools. And all of that is connected so that financial advisors can support their clients, or that in some cases, we have employers will buy access to just the app and the e-learning for individuals and allow their employees to improve their financial wellness.
That context is so important. I find it interesting that you're gearing this towards financial advisors because typically they're not focused on the cash part, are they? They're typically focused on the wealth building part. So what's the reception been?
Yeah, I mean, through no fault of their own, and
Yeah.
the industry is really built around products, and so that's how that happened. We've had great reception. Not every financial professional wants to give cash flow advice, but every client has cash flow, and every product they sell and every bit of advice connects or intersects or clashes with cash flow. So it's awfully important. What we've found is passionate financial professionals who got into the industry to help people are very keen adopters of cash flow management. And for many, they might not have that discipline themselves. They might not put that skill set in their own day-to-day, and they'll invite a member of their team, their associate, or even assistants can be trained to work in cash flow. And so we've seen great response so far, and we're really excited to help more people get more life from their money.
That's great. Now, we only have about a minute and 15 seconds left till the end of the show. What's one or two pieces of practical advice that you could give someone who wants to improve their savings habits?
Yeah, so that first tip I gave about physically separating our day-to-day, weekly would be the frequency that I would separate my day-to-day spending into a separate account because it's more likely to last. And then the other thing I would do is encourage you, if you read a blog or you see something that's a piece of financial information and you want to apply it to yourself, try to figure out a way immediately following reading that post about saving this or setting up an account and actually do something with it. So put it in your schedule, force yourself to do something. Just one little step at a time will make a huge difference.
All right. Thank you for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank
Stephanie
you.
Holmes-Winton. She's the CEO of CacheFlo. Well, that wraps up this edition of Strictly Money. You can catch our special financial literacy series every Sunday at 9:30 a.m. for the month of November, or follow me on Facebook at Saijal. Thanks for watching.